そのものが何者なのか。
Whether you like it or not, the use of 3D in your favorite anime is here to stay. To some, it is an affront to the quality of 2D animation of the years past. To others, it is inevitable due to the culture of cutting costs and the trend of quantity over quality. It's not all bad, but yeah, a lot of it is. Today, we'll take a look at both the good and bad use of 3D in anime. Hi, my name is Dong. I'm an animator working in the Japanese animation industry. So I think I'm in a good position to give you some insight into the inner workings of animation production. I'm originally from Canada, and growing up there, my first exposure to 3D animation was a show called Reboot. Originally airing in 1994, the series followed the main character Bob, who exists inside a computer system and has to play games with the user, or else everyone dies. Kids show. Reboot looks extremely dated now, but for the late 90s, it was a pioneer of 3D animation. Now, looking at a lot of the 3D stuff in Japan, it honestly feels like we haven't moved on much from Reboot. The same 90s style of limited animation, the overuse of camera moves just because they can, still exists in many instances of 3D animation in anime. Successful full 3D anime like Kemono Friends are successful despite being 3D, thanks to its writing and other elements, and looking at it now, the visuals still pull the whole thing down like a Chicago overcoat. Many Japanese 3D animation feel like an imitation of its 2D animation, but the 3D stuff can never be 2D no matter how hard you try. And it seems for every successful full 3D anime, there seems to be 3 shows that are just terrible. Do I even need to talk about X-Arm? This stuff looks beyond amateur, made by people who have no knowledge about the basics of animation and filmmaking. This series feels like they had no budget. But neither did Reboot, and that show was made by a bunch of people in a hotel room. Like I mentioned earlier, there's also a tendency for Japanese 3D productions to try and imitate the look and feel of 2D animation. A lot of 3D shows would move on 2s or 3s like with 2D animation, which each frame held for 2 or 3 frames respectively, instead of making everything on 1s. That low frame rate of 2D animation is a limitation of the medium, and this just does not exist in 3D. The ways that the characters move also feel like imitation of 2D animation, and look very rigid, which can be extremely hit or miss. For every good looking cut in Berserk 2016, there are twice that looks terrible. Instead of relying on the strength of 3D, Japan's 3D animation becomes a cheap imitation of something that it can never become. The weaknesses of Japan's full 3D anime also filters down to 2D anime with mixed 3D elements. How often have you been watching something and immediately lose all suspension of disbelief because of some terrible 3D crowds? You could be really enjoying something, but once you see those crappy CG crowds, that's all you can focus on. Some other super jarring things are when a sequence suddenly switches from being 2D animation to 3D animation. I know the Yowamushi Peru series is pretty infamous for this, and the recent Skeleton Knight Isekai 2, with the main character randomly moving from being 2D to 3D and vice versa. I actually worked on Skeleton Knight, so I think I can roast it. The sudden cuts between the 2 types of scenes makes it feel like you're watching 2 different shows spliced together, and this forces the anime's technical flaws to become the focus of the viewer. The artistry and warmth of 2D animation is often lost in the conversion to 3D. Obviously, the studios know this, and one thing that studios will try to do is to get the 3D animation to feel like 2D animation by having the 2D animator animate it. So yes, the 2D animator animates the 3D animation. The 2D animator would of course animate it roughly and pass on his poses to the 3D animator so they can match it. So why do studios even do all this CG stuff? Well, it is mostly a cost-saving measure. There are just certain types of scenes that are easier to do in 3D, and there are types that are easier to do in 2D. Certain things such as animating a bike and suit of armor is extremely tedious in 2D, but moving a 3D model around is multitudes faster. I worked on an old show called Somali and the Forest Spirit, and in that show there is a golem character that is extremely detailed. In order to avoid having to use 3D CG for him, and risk the audience being taken out of their suspension of disbelief, we drew him 2D. But he almost never moves and is generally a held drawing in most scenes. He doesn't even move his face when he speaks. Many studios have to make this choice: hand draw something, but that thing can never move, or make it 3D so that they can actually have animation in their anime. Instead of making the animation layers 3D, some production opt for making background elements 3D instead. I think this is a much better way of implementing CG. One of my favorite films, Metropolis, makes use of this a lot. The futuristic city is almost completely a 3D model, as well as the vehicles and other elements, but all the important layers like the characters and effects are still hand-drawn. Metropolis looks great. Instead of the CG elements being distracting, they become an integral part of the film and never looks out of place. I also think Metropolis is one of the last examples of a film that uses both traditionally hand-painted cells and CGI backgrounds. Studio Ufotable also makes use of CG backgrounds a lot to help power their crazy shots with the complicated camera work. All those giant action scenes with the camera orbiting around a character are powered with the CG backdrop. 3D mannequins of the characters are provided to the animators during rough animation, and the animators will draw over them in order to keep the characters looking like they belong in that environment. Even more common in anime production is the use of 3D layouts. These are rough 3D mock-ups of the scene made to match the storyboards. These are from the Decadence anime I worked on, and here you can see what they look like. While we only used these for a few scenes in Decadence, when I was working on a show called Haikyuu, almost all the indoor scenes in that series are done with the help of a 3D layout. Both the animator and the background painter will use the 3D roughs as a base, draw over them, and the finished product will look like any other scene in anime, but only take a fraction of the man-hours. This technique of using CG to assist the artist is used quite often actually. Remember those cars in Redline? Those are hand-drawn, yes, but they are drawn with the help of CG. And those Itano circus shots with the guy dodging the missiles too are done with the assistance of CG. I think moving forwards, I hope to see Japan's 3D animation try to diverge from its 2D stuff and maybe to have an identity of its own instead of trying to copy its older cousin. With the 2D stuff, the best way to implement 3D is with 3D layouts, helping to reduce workload but still looking visually pleasant. CG elements should never be that loud in a 2D anime, lest the viewer loses their suspension of disbelief. And I have yet to see a good CG crowd. Furthermore, often the low budgets of anime forces studio to take the cheaper option. As budgets increase, expect to see less CG shortcuts taken in your favorite shows. I've been working on Mob Psycho and Decadence director Tachikawa-san's next feature film. It has a good budget, and while there are tons of crowd scenes, expect almost none of them to have CG characters in them. And that's it for me. Thanks to everyone for watching. Big thanks to everyone supporting the channel on Patreon. This channel exists because of you. I've been posting some behind the scenes stuff from the industry there, so if you're interested in that kind of scene, check it out. Also check out my social media, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next time.